in this episode.
Pretty much psychoanalysis does not go without saying.
Mm.
That is, if we could be reductive, the core tenet of the logic of psychoanalysis, and pretty much combats Wittgenstein on the level of sensibility, whereas he's dealing with sense, senselessness, and nonsense. And the late Wittgenstein obviously is dealing with language games to the point where philosophy is just another language game.
Yeah.
And so, what we can't know or talk about, we must remain silent. Whereas Lacan would say, no, it does not go without saying. And so, for psychoanalysis, the truth of the unconscious may be half said. You can't say it all, but it does not go without saying. And thus, if you read or if you watch the interview on television, he says, the infamous quote, "I speak the truth, or at least I try to. It's impossible to say the whole truth. You can't say it all." And that ties in with what he's getting at in his later years, as a not only as a psychoanalyst, but the question concerning how do we teach this weird, you know, discourse or system.
Hey everyone, welcome to this conversation on Jacques Lacan and Freudo-Lacanian psychoanalysis with Andrew Flores, aka the Big Signorelli. I've been looking forward to this one, man. I really have. Andrew's a real cool and genuine dude, and I've learned a lot from him. In fact, I should mention this at the outset. A lot of the guests I've had on this podcast, some of the people that have really influenced my own thinking, I found them through his podcast, The Vanishing Mediators, which is sort of apart from being a podcast, I think calling it a podcast is a bit too simplistic, or it reduces what it is. It's rather an online Lacanian psychoanalysis cartel where they punctiliously go through all the seminars and break down what all of this Lacanian stuff is about. I mean, the goal really of this conversation when I pitched it to Andrew was, hey man, if there's someone there who just hears the word Lacan being thrown around by Zizek or some big philosopher or some Lacanian jargon being thrown at you, why in the world are all these philosophers, but also sociologists and psychologists and people kind of in the arts and the humanities are interested in Lacanian theory? Is it just to sound pretentious, name dropping some French intellectual, or is there really something there, something meaty and substantial, both psychologically but also metaphysically, perhaps? And my hope is with this conversation, some of those questions would be answered where you kind of do get what Lacanian theory is all about and what Lacan was talking about in the 1960s and 70s, or was it even later? Anyway, whenever the seminars were published. I wouldn't consider myself a Lacanian. Andrew certainly is, but I no doubt believe that for any kind of serious philosophical thinking, to paraphrase Alain Badiou, you have to go to Lacan. Because as far as I know, from the little I know, Lacan has the best theory of the subject. And I think for any kind of real serious thinking, you do need a solid theory of subjectivity to do any kind of philosophy or even science for that matter. And apart from this just being a great explication by Andrew on Lacanian concepts, he also gave a excellent reading list and recommended many books along the way. So, of course, all of these books, the links are in the show notes. Andrew is an autodidact on psychoanalysis, Marxism, theology, philosophy, and him being a real sincere and genuine guy, did share a bit on his own personal background towards the end of the conversation on what it's like for him to sort of, coming from a working class background and nonetheless having these what you'd call bourgeois intellectual pursuits. And I think that's why he does a great job, just because of his background and his very idiosyncratic character. He does a fantastic job at just talking about these ideas in a very sensible way and a fun way, through, of course, his memes and all of that. That's a whole other can of worms to open up there. But a quick, I should say, housekeeping note here. As you listen to the podcast, you certainly would see that this conversation was definitely an introductory conversation on Lacanian psychoanalysis. However, probably the first 20 to 30 minutes, I started recording while we were in the middle of another conversation. And so it's as if you suddenly jump into the unknown of some real technicalities of Lacanian theory. So just get through the first 20 to 30 minutes, and then after that, we'll get to the more introductory stuff. Just a heads up there. I didn't want the conversation to be too contrived, so I let Andrew go ahead with whatever he wanted to go with. And I think he had his teeth sunk in to some seminar, and his head was just in that space. And so he just started talking about that, which was pretty fun. With that being said, as per usual, a quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you more things. That being said though, forgive me for the tautology. We, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some kind of financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider financially supporting this podcast through Patreon, Substack, or PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering what are the perks, what are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall perks. You're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's publicly available is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters on Patreon, Substack, and even PayPal. However, if you're considering supporting the project, please do so only if you have the means. Alright, back to the episode. If you're interested in subjectivity and any kind of metapsychology, I highly recommend checking out Andrew's podcast, The Vanishing Mediators. And now, here's a conversation with Andrew Flores.
Let's just hope that we're gonna have to face all this stuff for the next 50 years or so of our life, right? So
Absolutely.
hope, things don't go all the way to shit.
Yeah. We can't fall into Pascalian despair. Is like
I don't really believe in that. I think Alain Badiou also, like, he once said that the way ideology functions is through cynicism. It makes people hopeless.
Mhm.
And I never believed in like that kind of cheap cynicism. It was just unproductive, and it's also a pusillanimous, just like, things have always been shit in some sense. Suck it up, and try to change something.
Yeah.
To put it
No,
clear.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's why I'm still like oriented around Marxism per se,
Yeah, I'd say, I don't know, like, I think I would certainly say I'm some kind of for sure, a communist and even a Marxist in terms of like the class analysis.
Mm-hmm.
But like when it comes to more of like the dialectical materialism, teleology and history, that's where I think I'm a lot more on Hegel's side.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like that like also comes like from like a lot of like one, there is a misreading of it from the level of scholasticism, but then at the end of the day, there's also this sort of appropriation, or I shouldn't say appropriation, so what I'm looking for, the sort of crude determinism that comes from Stalinism, right? And I think that's where we get like the sort of
I think the term,
teleology as like a final end, right?
I think Zizek has been trying to rescue dialectical materialism of what Stalin did to it. I think you're right. Stalinism is really what
Mhm.
made it like almost like a teleological project, bereft of contradictions, and that's in Hegelian sense. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, well, look,
absolutely.
man, in fact, if we're good to go, by the way, we're all good, right? Yeah.
All good.
In fact, in my head, you've already started. I even have a question regarding how uh Lacanian theory pertains to, well, yes, leftism, Marxism, but also contemporary politics. So I'm sure we can touch on that too. But yeah, Andrew, thanks for being here, man. Really appreciate it. Been enjoying the the work you've been doing on managing mediators, and then when I want like a quick hit early in the morning, I go to your Instagram and check out some memes and just gets me going. It's like my shot of caffeine. Just a
It's
quick
yeah,
hit.
the memes are your espresso hit, and I don't know if it's like if
It's
it's
like
a motivation or if it's a good laugh,
no,
or
it's a bit of both. It's a bit of both. Like I think Michael Downs, he has this notion that Jewish zones, there's like you microdose on Jewish zones every day. So
yeah, no, yeah, no, yeah, and it's very Lacanian. It's like
a little bit
as
like
he
that. Yeah.
says, I think it which seminar is it? I think it's either in 16 or 17. Jouissance is first like a tickle and ends as a blaze of petrol.
Is that really is that
Yeah, it's what Lacan says. I forget
oh
it
I had
what
no idea.
seminar is. I think it's in 16 or 17.
I've
I could
really
be.
only heard this from Michael Downs, not from because I mean I've only read one of Lacan's seminars, so I'm not too
Yeah, no, Michael Downs is really good at like
100%.
locating all these
Yeah,
lines of jouissance, and
yeah,
him being a reader of also Zizek, he's able to like apply the ideology side to it. Yeah, but like Michael Downs like has been really a big influence on me in my upcoming work and like as a sort of a Lacanian. I don't think he would identify as a Lacanian as much, although he is influenced by Lacan.
mm,
I would consider myself more of a sort of like card carrying Lacanian. Michael Downs more along aligns with more the Zizekian interpretation of Lacan, or like the Zizek Todd McGowan, and where like uh not that I have like any like theoretical differences or anything like that, but I say I align more, even though I am, influenced by Zizek. I think we all are to some extent.
sure.
Um, what I liked about Zizek was that he introduced me to thinkers that I would have never known if it wasn't for him. So, for instance, the Japanese Marxist Kojin Karatani.
Karatani,
Um,
yes,
yeah,
yes.
and then who else? Lorenzo Chiesa, which he has that back and forth debate. It's actually a trinity debate between Chiesa, um, Johnston, and
Austin, Austin.
Zizek. Yeah,
Yeah.
Adrian Johnson, which I know you had him
Yeah, I
on your
know.
show.
Yeah, that was truly a privilege. I mean, in fact, for me, I was introduced to Adrian Johnston through Zizek, obviously, his book, Zizek's Ontology. And man, like, I just like the way Adrian writes. It's just because he kind of writes a bit like not really like an analytic philosopher, but I think simply ipso facto him being American, he just has that sensibilities of writing in in that way, and deeply still resonate with that. Even though I know people say analytic philosophy is dry and boring, which I concur, but
And I agree, and it's funny that you brought that up, that transition, because one, I think he's definitely in dialogue with analytic philosophy
very much.
regarding materialism, and not like logical positivist analytic philosophy, but more like in the way that the Anglophone side of things wants to like still rest on these sort of problems, sort of outside of the history of the discourse. So, for instance, mind-body dualism, other minds, the problem of materials and materialism and idealism from a sort of analytic sense in which, like, again, like you're just handling the arguments from a sort of logical rigor than like seeing the concept develop, not like in a Hegelian sense, although we could add that as well, but just in the fact of like how it emerged through the continental aspect. But I really like that you brought up analytic philosophy, because I actually watched your recent talk with, I think it's Michael Porter. Yeah, and you know we're obviously going to talk about Lacan, and yeah, that book
He
right there.
wrote
I
this
definitely
really
want
good
to
book.
keep
I
that.
do really recommend it, even if you're not interested in like, logicism and Frege and Russell, but like just let's call it as a work of history of analytic philosophy. It's really cool read. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree. I definitely want to check him out. I really loved what he said though, and why I like the analytic philosophy bit is because we come to think of Lacan, since our talk is going to be mainly about psychoanalysis and Lacanian psychoanalysis. Lacan oriented within like the substratum of a continental thought, French theory, post-structuralism, postmodernism. But when you actually read Lacan's seminars, he's indebted, of course, to Freud. But he is drawing from many thinkers, of course, Hegel, but mainly the analytic tradition. He's influenced by Quine. He's influenced by Russell. He's extremely influenced and in dialogue with Wittgenstein. And you'll see this throughout the entire seminars, including the later ones. And then, of course, in one that's recently being published right now. And it's in English from the Cormac McGallagher side, but it's a text by him called Liatoldi, which is written in axiomatic form, almost like a sort of Spinoza's geometry type thing, which the basic premise is regarding that of the axiom and discourse. And fundamentally, the root of the axiom is it does not go without saying, right? Pretty much psychoanalysis does not go without saying. That is, if we could be reductive, the core tenet of the logic of psychoanalysis, and pretty much combats Wittgenstein on the level of sensibility, whereas he's dealing with sense, senselessness, and nonsense. And the late Wittgenstein obviously is dealing with language games to the point where philosophy is just another language game.
Yeah.
And so what we can't know or talk about, we must remain silent, whereas Lacan would say, no, it does not go without saying. And so for psychoanalysis, the truth of the unconscious may be half said. You can't say it all, but it does not go without saying. And thus, if you read or if you watch the interview on television, he says, the infamous quote, I speak the truth, or at least I try to. It's impossible to say the whole truth. You can't say it all. And that ties in with what he's getting at in his later years, as a not only as a psychoanalyst, but the question concerning how do we teach this weird, discourse or system, if you could call it that.
Well, if I could put it in very plain, almost pedestrian language here, is Lacan's point that Wittgenstein has like the sense and nonsense, right? So the nonsense we can't say anything, but Lacan is saying that the nonsense itself can be said, but not fully it can be said in its, let's call it, incompleteness. Is that kind of what he's trying to get at?
Yes, but there is a qualification, and I know you had much questions, and we're jumping, into like full guns blazing.
No, no, no,
Um,
it's fine. I mean,
but
yeah, we'll keep going.
this ties in with the theory of the registers, the imaginary, symbolic, and real. Sense, sensibility, from a Kantian sense, right, is it's of course does have a role to play in knowledge, but of course Kant was involved with the conditions of possibility. And it's funny, I'm looking at your Kant poster behind you, so so like what he's aiming at is not on the level of sense or sensibility. Now, what I know Wittgenstein probably doesn't mean it in the Kantian sense. I'm drawing a sort of parallel, but I think philosophy is, in a sense, uh, aiming at knowledge and understanding um, from different areas, but ultimately we seem sort of intuited by this notion of sense. In politics, it's always good sense or common sense. But we seem to fall short. For Lacan's sense, and this is a problem with a lot of clinicians that he's in polemics with, is that the imaginary level is formulated on concepts of understanding and sensibility. We're not even dealing with nonsense, because that is, in a way, a reified version of the imaginary. We're getting at the real, and we're neither dealing with sense or nonsense, but absence, which is a neologism of absence and sense. So it's ab-sense. And then he plays on with it with ab-sex, which, because what psychoanalysis is investigating is, the infamous, there is no such thing as a sexual relation. And
Yeah.
so we are at the interstices of the impossibility of formalism and formalization, right? And this is where absence is, the ability to formalize the impasse at the side of formalization, right? So that is what the real gets at. And going back to analytic philosophy, what he liked about analytic philosophy, and especially like Quine and all these other thinkers, was like, trying to grapple with mathematics and logic. And Lacan wants to bring mathematics and logic back, into a relation, because he believes that mathematics is able to account as a writing, the sites of impasses, but also to create new writings to account for those impossibilities. And so why does this matter, right? It's not just heavy jargon or Lacanians being esoteric or obscure. What we're getting at is something that can't be formalized or placed on a level of understanding, and it is Freud's discovery, the unconscious.
Unconscious. Yeah.
The unconscious is not some Jungian
No.
archetype, nor is it this sort of internal cauldron of instincts and all these fantasies. It's something that is in the gaps of speech, and as the infamous aphorism is, the unconscious is a structure like a language, and it is like a language, it is not a language. And that it does involve writing, because one, the analyst is writing everything that the patient is saying. But when you're formalizing these systems of signifiers, we're getting at something that is sort of impossible to understand on the level of sensibility, on the level of common sense, and even on the level of sort of symbolic systems and networks of discourse. It's something that, like mathematics, is on the level of pure writing, right? And you only plug in, the sort of, signification retroactive, like active, after the fact. But the main thing is like, one of the things that he likes about mathematics and logic and mathematical logic is he also sees physics doing the same thing. Physics is sort of caught in its own imaginary misunderstanding, because it confuses nature with its model of nature. For Lacan, nature is indifferent to what we're doing. We don't change nature with discourse. We only change the discursive nature from our discursive writing. And he's so obsessed with energetics, and we could talk about that later. But really, what we get at is like all these paradoxes in physics with these mathematical formalizations. And when we encounter that, we are also able to encounter the problem of our own system, but mainly with these mathematical formulas that physics relies on. They again are misrecognizing the fact that this is not nature itself. This is discursive nature. This is on the level of mathematical formalism and formalization. Formalization is trying to create a language out of formal writing. And that is where the misrecognition is, because while it is not a language in the sense like I'm writing English or writing in Japanese or whatever, we have, we have the impulse to talk about mathematics as if it were a language, but it is not, right? And in the same way, this is what the real is, when we encounter that sort of impossibility. And so for Lacan, the transmission of knowledge or the transmission of truth from this real impossibility is what he will call, or liken the term, the mathem, right? And that is these mathematical devices that he writes down that operate in that way. They transmit something within the psychoanalytic act. Someone like Badiou will take on this thing to transmit something on the level of truth and the being of truth with his event theory.
Yeah, I mean, look, you mentioned Badiou. It's funny you said that, because I was just thinking of, so for Badiou, mathematics is ontology, right? There's something quite interesting, because I remember reading and being an event, uh, like for Badiou, even within mathematics, the reason he likes mathematics firstly is because it's a very clean and neat language, in terms of how the signifiers and the kind of symbolic system, but also he says that things like the Russell's paradox, for instance, is a way you get at that. And he uses this term Lacanian real. Like for him, that is kind of like the Lacanian real, where there is a impasse. There's a paradox that you can't go move beyond in some sense, and we are faced with that. And it's funny. Like in this book we were talking about, Michael Potter's book, he even says that when Russell sent Frege the letter saying, "Hey, look, I've discovered this paradox in your system," it put Frege into like a depression. Literally, it broke him down. So I mean, that's kind of how traumatic it was for Frege. Yeah. So anyway, be that as it may, there's a lot here. I mean, I think what I'm going to do is when I'm recording the introduction for this, I'm going to tell the listeners to just get through the first 20 minutes of this discussion, because my goal with this was, so the overall idea is, if someone comes into this podcast that have no idea at all what in the world Lacan is, knows of Freud as his name, essentially, but suddenly, maybe through Zizek, maybe through Todd McGovern, to someone got interested in Lacanian theory and they want to study Lacanian theory. So the notion is, how can I study Lacanian theory? And here I'll use the term that I really like by the time energy guys said, sorry, the theory underground guys, time energy. They don't have time, they don't have energy, and studying Lacan, it's a it's not an easy feat. That being said, though, I also want to quote Zizek here. Zizek says, as a Marxist, let me add, if anyone tells you Lacan is difficult, this is class propaganda by the enemy. So I really like that quote. So I am of the belief, so I am not, I wouldn't say I'm a Lacanian. I'm more I wouldn't say I'm a part of the Lacanian cabal, so to speak. Rather, I think any kind of thinking has to go through Lacan, the way I think Badu makes that point too. So I kind of view this in a almost like there's like a buffet of concepts, and I kind of, whenever I want to theorize and understand the world for my own thinking, I always utilize Lacanian concepts because they're so useful. Lacanian and Freudo-Lacanian concepts, to be fair, and of course even Jacobian. So along those lines, how, in your view, how should one at first approach Lacan? Because again, as you did kind of intimate, you are very much, let's call it card-carrying Lacanian, right? You engage with the seminars, and clearly, whenever I hear you speak, even right now, but even publicly, I can see that you're really working through the seminars punctiliously. Um, but let's say someone simply, not that they're not interested, but just due to the brute realities of life, haven't got the time and energy. How do you think one should initially approach Lacanian theory and studying Lacanian theory?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say also it'd be beneficial to seek analysis if that is also your goal, if you're curious about psychoanalysis yourself. And that is also opens up another can of worms, because then we're talking about, method of payment and affordability and, the times we live in. But, I think one of the benefits of the Lacanian world is that they're sort of acclimated around a sort of, needless to say, leftist sentiment of some sort, or the sort of conscious awareness of the effects of capitalism, not only as a discourse, as a sort of symbolic network, but also in the way that it affects people economically. So that, I think, that is one of the beauties of like Lacanian psychoanalysis, is that you negotiate prices. And to really answer your question of one who's interested in studying it, well, the time that you do have, use it wisely to study Lacan and Lacanian theory. Now, the beauty of technology is that you also have podcasts, online cartels, and study groups that are recording their stuff. And if you're serious about studying the seminars, which I highly recommend starting with the seminars, do not start with the Accrete, because you will definitely be turned off right away. I know many people that have done it. I did not do it, thankfully. But that we're just like, I don't understand anything. Of course. Um, the French philosopher Jean-Claude Milner says that like Lacan inverts the sort of Greek Platonic, exoteric writings and then the sort of esoteric initiations of the secret writings, where it's like, okay, actually the exoteric writings, which are the Écrits, which were published publicly, are sort of obscure and esoteric, and then the esoteric seminars are actually more exoteric. So Lacan is kind of inverting, that whole Platonic Western tradition of philosophy in that sense. So deal with that as you will. I would say that there are, of course, some, really good secondary literature, but I would also put a disclaimer that a lot of secondary literature and commentary will actually confuse you more. It is not like reading Hegel, where someone like Stephen Houlgate is really good. Terry Pinkert, of course, Slavoj. I wouldn't call him a secondary source, but he has, like, for me, broken down Hegel in a way that is probably really good, especially with For They Know Not What They Do. I think that is his best text on Hegel. And who else? Like Todd McGowan.
Adrian Johnson, I bet.
Adrian Johnston, as far as Hegelians, and then Kant. Actually, I don't even know much of the Kant commentary scholarship, but I would say, like, in the same thing, you would need commentary works. But like for Lacan, you want the least amount of secondary sources. But for those that I do recommend, it would be first and foremost Lorenzo Chiesa's Subjectivity and Otherness. That is a really good book. It's very technical, but it is not hard, and he systematizes like all the chapters by like Lacan of the 1950s, Lacan of the early 60s, late 60s and 70s, and I think that's really good, and it goes over all the central concepts. Let's see, there is, you could also find, like, on Amazon, there's this commentary anthology edited by Jacques-Alain Miller, and which is Lacan's son-in-law, and then Bruce Fink. It's called Reading Seminars, and
Okay.
so you have Reading Seminars 1 and 2, which are together 1 and 2,
Yeah.
and I will say they'll help you with general concepts, but they won't help you understand 1 and 2, sadly.
Hold on, we lost you there, Andrew, for a bit.
Yeah. Oh, I was saying that Seminar 11, reading commentary by Jacques-Alain Miller, is definitely a lot, and Bruce Fink, a lot more aligned with the seminar than
Yeah.
reading 1 and 2.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
then there's Seminar 20. Let's
what
see.
about the Lacanian subject? I mean, that for me, I still do think one of the best
By
introductory
Bruce Fink, right?
I would think. Yeah.
Yeah, anything by Fink is really good
Yeah,
and really
very
basic.
clear too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or should I say fundamental? I think Bruce Fink is good to give you a general understanding. Um, let's see, Colette Soler. She is a French analyst, and she has one called like Reinventing the Unconscious and What Lacan Said About Women. I think those are also good ones to read. And I'm very, very biased about it just because of the fact of, like, most of the commentary obscure a lot more and then use ad nauseum. Oh, desire is the desire of the other. And Zizek, it's funny we mentioned Zizek a lot. He used this term called poetics of lack, in which they overemphasize desire so much that it becomes this sort of like poetry of desire, of like, oh, why you're miserable because you never get the thing you want, you're always lacking, and it becomes this sort of Sartrean existentialism. I think that just like is sort of so redundant that it kind of mystifies what Lacan is talking about. So that's what I'll say. And then as far as like how to go about it, especially if you have little time, energy, I would say, like, if you're thinking about like Lacan, if you are driving to work, or you take the public transit to work, or you could wear headphones while you work, I would listen to like some podcasts that are on Lacan. And I'm not talking about just my own. Daniel Tutt's got Emancipation's
Yeah,
podcast
one of the
has some
best
really good
podcasts
ones
out there.
of
Yeah.
seminars. Let's see, Samuel McCormick lectures on Lacan. Why Theory.
Theory Underground, yeah, Wide Theory, and then Theory Underground guys do like these long streams.
Yeah. So like people that are into
And
that are very
Michael
helpful.
Downs, like, it's a good one, like the Medium. They've got the listen function, and if you go and like listen to Michael Downs's piece on, it'll be a long, almost like an audio
Yeah.
long long piece on the
Yeah,
objet
yeah,
petit a. That's the
yeah. His one on objet petit a
yeah,
is good, and then his
brilliant
one on
book.
the
Yeah,
phallus is really good as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
Um, and then like if you like really care about the seminars, mine we really like we go nitty gritty into that. And there is another guy. Although I would say he's one that isn't so much of, hey, let me listen to while I work or work out. He's more of, you kind of have to sit down and watch because of his visuals. But Singularity as Sublimity, Brian Becker, who I've actually had on my channel twice to talk about. So um, with that, that's the listening side. But how to read, I honestly would say, besides the secondary sources that I've listed, read Freud. Read Freud, because you will not understand Lacan without reading Freud, and reading Freud alongside Lacan. And the benefit about reading the seminars is that he's always interested in a certain Freud text that is very like he's interested in and is very crucial. And so like seminar one, he's interested in Freudian papers on technique and metapsychology. There is one for English speakers. It's not the technique one, but it is on metapsychology, and it's published by Philip Reith. It is Freud's papers on metapsychology. So it's got essays like on narcissism, an introduction, on negation. These are important texts that are essays that Freud wrote and aren't really talked about enough unless you're really into Freud or you're really into Lacan. Because when most people read Freud, they try to read interpretation of dreams, but they're like, I don't understand it. They try to read like, I don't know, Totem and Taboo, and they're just like, I don't know what this is. And or I try to read the introductory lectures. And so they come from it from like a sort of like non-psychoanalytic understanding, and
yeah.
it's
Or
hard.
even civilization and discontent, which is like
Which is an important one. Is an important one, but
text, but
if
yeah, that's not
you don't
what Freud
understand the
is.
context of it, you think it's like pseudo sociology.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, it's probably one of the best books I've read in my life, to be honest. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think like reading Freud along the seminars is important. So like I'm not one that gives the best advice about reading Lacan because one, I'm still struggling with this stuff. But what my colleague Nick and I, for our Vanishing Mediators channel, and Max, what we really did was just dedicate ourselves, not worrying about like this sort of super ego of like you have to read everything. Um, this sort of university super ego of just like read. Like it is more of just taking our time with the time we had with this each seminar one by one. Starting with seminar one, probably not going to be the most attractive, statement, but starting with seminar one is important. I know all of our favorite, people that talk about Lacan are referencing seminar 11, or they're referencing seminar 17 because of the discourses, or they're referencing seminar 20 because he's talking about there is no such thing as a woman, or the woman does not exist, or there's no sexual relation, all these sort of things that we hear that's like fortune cookie wisdom. Start at seminar one. It will help you out because you will have a better understanding of not only Lacan and what he's doing in the early years, but also a better understanding of Freud than most people. And one of the things that I've noticed about a lot of people, even Lacanians, that are up there, their knowledge of Freud is not that good. And I'm not saying that I'm the best or anything, but like when I hystericize in these reading groups, I realize that they don't know their Freud. And needless to say, their Lacan is even doxastic, and I think like that's the beauty of like someone like Lorenzo Chiesa or like Zizek, because they're really adamant about like reformulating these concepts and getting into these seminars. And Adrian Johnson too, and that's why I like that three-way debate, because they're arguing like on a different level. But and I would say like somebody like who's really good at the seminars, who's reading them line by line, is Sam McCormick from Lectures on Lacan. So I would recommend his stuff too, because he's doing like the line by line. And I mean, that's all I have to say is like, as far as your question concerning like how to start, especially somebody that's got like little time energy that has to work, but is interested in theory and can't get, this quality knowledge or quality learning from the university. Like it's going to be a struggle, but I think one of the things about Lacan is in the way that you read him. And there's another thing, is how to read him. Read him like he's talking to you, like it's a conversation, because it is a lecture. He's talking to people. He's not
Yeah.
writing these things down.
I've got to interject a bit here, please, Andrew. Actually, could you please expand on that point? Because here's what I mean, right? I think a lot of people, especially if they're like in the English department, so kind of doing a humanities degree, probably have come across like Lacan. Uh, However, I think the reason people are a bit turned off by him. Not that we need to like propagandize for Lacan. I mean, if you don't want to read Lacan, fine, you, But it's rather if you think there's something, if you think you want to think deeply about the theory of the subject, think deeply about the place of the unconscious. If you want to think deeply about, in fact, do a sort of a sociological analysis, which is like this is very common for everyone to make these broad claims, sociological claims, without really, in my view, working through, doing the necessary work through psychoanalytic theory that's focused on subjectivity. Okay, be that as it may, what I'm trying to say is, could you expand on what, like, when one approaches Lacan, as in what kind of intent should one approach it with? Because should one approach it with the intent of knowledge? And what I mean by that is, like, for instance, so I'm a software engineer, right? Sometimes I'd want to upskill on a programming language. And what I would do is either read a programming book, I've got a whole bunch of books here on a certain concept, or I would go and watch a tutorial on YouTube, um, Java or Go or whatever the case may be. And then there, my intent is very much set, focus. I am your slave. Whatever you tell me, just let me absorb it all in that very in that very, or I almost become a computer. Just like feed me information. And I'm curious, in your view, when one approaches texts like Lacan seminars, and then maybe eventually if people get to it after, maybe even after the secondary literature, agree, how should one approach those texts?
So two things. One, I forgot that you mentioned, because then you mentioned a lot of your podcasts that you're a software engineer. So I was in the Navy for 8 years, and I was a gas turbine tech, the electrical side. So like I did a lot of calibration, a lot of circuit cards, and I dealt with like logic gates and ors and stuff like
Oh yeah,
that.
you know what I
And
mean,
so
right?
like as a Sparky, like if I don't understand this piece of equipment, whether it's a motor controller, whether it's a generator, I'm gonna go to the tech manual. I'm gonna read the schematics. I'm gonna trace all these diagrams so I learn how the system,
That's
how
it.
it works,
Exactly. Yeah.
troubleshooting, right? And then your thing about I am your slave, right? Well, isn't that exactly what the knowledge production of the university does? Is it makes people slaves as ignorant students while maintaining mastery. And even the professors themselves are slaves to
Absolutely.
the all-knowing of the master. What Lacan does is, one, gets you frustrated because, again, he is free associating as he teaches, meaning he's saying what is on his mind, whatever is on his mind he's saying, but with intent, which means he's obviously teaching lessons regarding Freud and what these certain concepts are in psychoanalysis. And so there's an interesting formula that I found helpful when you're reading it. And of course, you're going to be frustrated because he's going to be talking about Freud. Then he's going to be talking about this weird poet. Then he's going to be making weird puns with French and Latin and Spanish. And then he's going to be talking about some random intellectual. And then towards the middle and the end, he'll start to get to the point about, what it is that makes Freud's concept so crucial, and he'll leave you on a cliffhanger till the next session, and then he'll start to get into it more in depth than he did in the last one, right? So there is this way, and he gets you frustrated. You work through that frustration, but one of the main things that he has to give us regarding teaching and learning is to let go of knowledge in the way that we understand it, of like, give me information, I am your slave, you are my master, or I am your student, you are my teacher. It's almost like a Zen koan, where it's like pretty much like you are the if I could even use this term, true knowledge. The knowledge that psychoanalysis gives you is to let go of knowledge, but also to evoke and exacerbate your desire and your ignorance. so that you learn and you build those questions and you begin to work through all these affects that are centered around your desire to know and your lack. And I think that's the most important thing, is to be able to wrestle with that and to use these passions, because there are three passions of psychoanalysis. It is love, it is hate, and it is ignorance. And ignorance is the one that is important to psychoanalysis insofar as that if you are trying to learn, it's going to exacerbate your desire for the subject supposed to know and to put the teacher into question. That is like what guides the hysteric, and also what is able to act as an agent to undermine mastery, and also to undermine the master within you, to see what it is that you are trying to learn, but also the phantasmatic kernel around what you're trying to learn that you impose upon the text, dispel your fantasy, and actually like learn from the first time without trying to respond or be like, give me now, the demand.
I don't think I understood that bit, what you meant by hystericize the teacher, hystericize the master, or
Yeah, in a sense, what I'm saying is that to also provoke the sort of image that you have about the teacher or what you're trying to learn. And what I mean by hystericize is sort of expose even your own fantasy of what it means to have knowledge and what this person that you think has the knowledge is doing. And that's what psychoanalysis does. And so far as like when you're under the laying on the couch, when you're free associating, the more you go through your sessions, the more that your desire, your transference, which we'll get into because I know we're going to talk more about Lacan and psychoanalysis par excellence. A lot of these emotions, these unconscious contents, project onto the analyst, and you think the analyst has this something, whether it's this knowledge or this thing that's going to cure you and make you normal or make you better, make you invincible, or like make you just like, the person that's not suffering anymore, that doesn't suck. And that's not what they're going to do. But you have to be able to dispel that. In the same way, you have to let go of also the way that you understand what learning and knowledge is, whether it's like how you learned in school, or if you're an academic, like how to let go of, that sort of that training, which just makes you produce, subjects of mastery and ignorant students that will never learn. They just hope to attain whatever it is. And I think that is like the hard thing to grapple with, from an outside perspective, because then you'd be like, oh, that just sounds like it's all bullshit. But no, the whole thing is that it's about being able to reframe your relationship to knowledge, because our relationship to knowledge is one commodified under capitalism. So it just produces, something that relates science, technology, which also can quantify it to create more production, to create more commodities, et cetera, et cetera. But also it creates more systems of hierarchy in which intellectual labor is just about creating students and creating professors with degrees and certs, but never education or whatever. And psychoanalysis, it's a sort of byproduct of this university discourse where it's actually dispelling the myth of the all-knower, the philosopher king, if you will have it, this like all-seeing eye or whatever. What it is just like being able to realize the sort of knowledge that you're seeking for, or that you're in search for, is rather also the key to your symptom. It is just exacerbated by your desire, your own lack. It's a fantasy. It doesn't mean that there's no truth or no knowledge. That's not what it's saying. It's that what you're trying to search for is actually produced by a fantasy, right? That's what I mean. And so like to hystericize the master, or to hystericize the teachers, to also tether with your own phantasmatic projection of that as well.
absolutely. I mean, I'd say this, right. So you used the term, or you put the phrase, reformulating or reconceiving one's relationship to knowledge. Now, look, put it like that in a very formal sense, it becomes meaningless. But like the moment you said that, I almost viscerally I knew what you meant because it's like you need to go through the process of working through this theory. And as a matter of fact, as you mentioned, even Lacanian psychoanalysis in the proper, like on the couch in the clinic kind of sense. Because I think that's where I always believe, at least I've come to a point in life, just as a neophyte, to do any kind of thinking, you need to go through Lacan because it does. When I mean go through Lacan, I mean really go through Freud and psychoanalysis, and then whatever's on the other side, it will be, you will have a, let's call it a, yeah, a different relationship to whatever knowledge is. And I think this is like almost breaking that fantasy. That being said, though, and I very much agree with Helen Rollins here. I'm not. I don't think neither one of us are saying that fantasy is a bad thing. Like fantasy is what makes life worth living, in the sense that you need fantasy, but you need to understand how, in some sense, fantasy functions in a meta-psychological sense.
Yeah, and I will say like that's important because it's like we're never going to get rid of fantasy. We only traverse it, and what I'm saying is that really what we need to dispel and what Lacan and learning psychoanalysis does is help us unlearn our relationship, our sort of investment to the phantasmatic kernel that comes with knowledge. And it's that there is this sort of big other as a subject supposed to know that has all the sort of keys to living life, whether it's like knowledge as far as like academic intellectual knowledge, or the sort of knowledge of how to live life and how to have OTM, how to have leisure and all that stuff. Like there's somebody out there that's enjoying, and the fact is like nobody's enjoying.
That's
you know
correct. Yeah, yeah. I mean,
and the this big other that we think is there, that is the kernel for fantasy, is lacking, is split.
yeah.
That's you pretty much
And
what.
here, of course, I mean, we don't have to go here because it's a whole other can of worms. We can see the beautiful isomorphism, I guess, to use a mathematical term, with Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. I mean, this is where the Ljubljana school or the Slovenian school really couple Lacan and Hegel, and I think that notion of there's, yeah, the absolute knowing is in some sense seeing the contradictions when you come to that position in everything, including the big other. So I mean that's crucial for me. But that being said, I don't want to get too carried away getting into Hegel land right now, Andrew. But so to focus on Lacanian concepts, right? I think for anyone now approaching this conversation, I'm kind of thinking of the imaginary listener now. They've kind of been thrown a lot of resources for sure, and hopefully we've kind of articulated what, at least in our view, and more importantly in your view, how one should approach Lacanian theory. And now maybe to flesh out a bit of Lacan's concepts. So, okay, we touched on the triad, symbolic, imaginary, real, of course, and then we spoke of desire, lack. Of course, drives really important. This is the all drives are kind of like a depth drive in that sense for Lacan. And then we have yeah, on the objet petit, yeah, the objet A. So I don't know where you want to take this, but how do you think, with the limited time we have, we can outline some of Lacan's most crucial concepts to why, again, so many people think he's a thinker worth paying attention to?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. We covered a lot, and I'll have to condense a lot within a short period of time, and I'll do it in a way that is interesting in how I've pretty much grappled with my time with Freud and Lacan. So it'll be from my work in seminars 1 through 3, and the way that these concepts unfold in how I've studied seminar 11 and my current work with seminar 16. So, what is psychoanalysis, right? To cut a long story short, it is the talking cure. That's the sort of, poetic way of saying it. But it was this sort of, discourse or methodology invented by Freud, because Freud was a scientist. Freud studied neurology. Freud is a physician, and with his case studies on hysteria by it was a co-authored work with him and another colleague of his named Joseph Breuer. And the discovery of the talking cure comes from this woman who's got the pseudonym Anna O, and she suffered from a lot of like what we call neurotic symptoms, but specifically hysteria and conversions, which means like a lot of like repressed symptoms from memory disturbances and trauma, rather than being sort of revealed through memory and recounting these events, converted into bodily symptoms like dizziness, headaches, hallucinations, migraines, you name it. And I'm just kind of generalizing. There's more to this notion of conversion and hysteria. But she was talking to Breuer, and it was like, I just want you to talk to me, like, nothing else, and let me talk. And it was through the talking cure and just saying whatever was on her mind that she would feel better each day. And Freud was very intrigued by this. And so, needless to say, over time, there was what we would now call transference, but I'll get into that. But what is interesting is that Joseph Breuer goes on vacation, and I think his wife, was pregnant, and then they were going to have, I think, that baby during that time or shortly after. Anna O was projecting these sort of fantasies that she wanted Joseph's baby, and these emotions got too much for Breuer that he just cut off with it. And Freud was like, "No, what are you doing, man? This thing is called the transference. This is this other's desire, the other's unconscious." And so he thought there was a lot of therapeutic efficacy to this. And so, what is this transference? This is one of not only the fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, but it is also a technique of psychoanalysis. And it aligns with this notion called free association, which is to say whatever is on your mind. Like, I mean, anything and everything. At least you can't say everything, just whatever is on your mind at that time and however long we have for the session. And the transference is, you could say, it's one of the hardest things to define. But if I have to describe it, for psychoanalysis, it's being able to encounter the unconscious through the projection of fantasy, but also the way that the patient's desire exacerbates in the session and outside the session, because there is a pathological kernel, a symptom that comes from that desire, and it formulates the unconscious through, again, not only the fantasy, but also the dreams, and also things that come up in the free association, and the way that the analyst gets lumped into that, and whatever sort of associations that come from the patient's past. Another simple way to say it in a Lacanian sense, it's to have the feeling that there is someone that is the subject supposed to know, right? What we were talking about earlier, the way in which we believe that this person, has something that they could give us.
And just to interrupt, I don't think we mentioned this. So that would be, in this case, the analyst would be the subjects that's supposed to know.
Right. That on the level of the patient, like, they would think that the analyst is the subject supposed to know, that they have this sort of hidden thing, and they're this analyst, they're this doctor, so they have the key to my desire, they have the key to my suffering, my symptom. So now let's get into Lacan, and we're still going to talk about Freud. So Lacan is in seminar 1, right? It's called Freud's Papers on Technique. It is both a reinvention of the Freudian system, but also an investigation of what psychoanalysis is through these papers on technique and on metapsychology. Now, I've said that before, but we should also define what that is. So metapsychology is different from the technique of psychoanalysis. It is like the model, right? It's like we have the theory and we have the praxis. So the clinical free association, the transference and interpretations are the praxis. the theory and model and methodology are metapsychology. Adrian Johnston, we mentioned earlier, he has this really good way of describing Freud's theory of metapsychology in Time Driven, which is his, I think, his doctoral dissertation. And he says that metapsychology is both the way in it is a system of psychoanalysis, but it's both a theory that exposes the limits of science and also responds to the ontological questions of philosophy. And so the metapsychological papers have things like repression, the unconscious, understanding like the models of the mind or of the psyche for Freud. And so for Lacan in Seminar 1, he is investigating why Freud, because his polemics are against what is called ego psychology. Ego psychology is a derivative of Freud's theories by his daughter, Anna Freud. And Anna Freud, rather than privileging this sort of thing called the unconscious, privileges this ego as the thing that needs to be cured, and we need to make the ego stronger, and also by the defenses. And when we make this ego stronger, we are going to be somewhat more, sane or healthier, or we are rehabilitated, or we could now be socially adapted to society. Now, I'm not saying that Anna Freud herself says this, but her privileging of the ego as the thing to focus on creates this sort of domino effect in which everybody takes on this and this way of thinking with psychoanalytic theory. And Lacan does not want any part of that. His reorientation of Freud and the importance of the unconscious is through, the way that Lacan thinks of this sort of structural model of the imaginary, symbolic, and the real. So we'll get into that. But with this Seminar 1, one of the papers in the metapsychology that he is focused on is to start this whole understanding of the imaginary, symbolic, and the real, is this paper called Die Verneinung by Freud, or in English, negation. And pretty much the unconscious, whatever this thing is, which is structured by repression, which, is the reason, why we're suffering, doesn't manifest in its immediate form. It manifests in this sort of bungled speech action called negation. And so Freud gives this example of a patient in free association who says, I have a dream about a woman, but before you say anything, I can guarantee you it's not my mother, right? So it's a very famous example.
Really,
and so it's very trivial. Yeah. It's very nonsensical and mundane, even hilarious. But the point is that if Freud really thought that, then one, he wasn't thinking about that, and nor did he even bring that up. It was the patient that had to initiate that response prior to describing the dream. And this is not a conscious response. It is something of the unconscious. And yet at the same time, the way that it intersects doesn't allow this sort of phenomenon to have any sort of identification with the patient. Like, this response has no connection to their conscious network, right? It is a manifestation of negation or denial as a form of negation due to repression. It isn't repression. It is a denial of something that is repressed, and it affirms itself by denying, right? So that is one of the main things that Lacan is interested. And why is he interested in this? Is because this is the way that the ego defends against, what the unconscious is, or the symptom of the unconscious, the truth of one's history and why they suffer. And so this begins to be the focal point of that seminar. The French Hegelian Jean Hippolyte gives a commentary on this, but the emphasis on negation or denial shows that there is a sort of again, to bring up Zizek, there is a negativity towards, subjectivity, and what is affirmed, is affirmed through the negative.
Negative, yes.
What Alenka and I think Zizek like coined this joke about like the dude who goes to order coffee, says, I like a coffee without milk. Sorry, we don't have any milk. I could give you a coffee without creamer. So it's not this immediate black coffee, because coffee without creamer doesn't, indicate black coffee.
Yeah.
And in its nomenclature, the nomenclature for black coffee would be black coffee. And so like the nomenclature of coffee without cream is that we don't have cream, or we don't have milk, so the nomenclature coffee without milk, its opposite or its negation would be, coffee without cream.
Yeah,
So
this, yeah, like at an empirical level, it's still coffee, but
yeah, right.
the negativity comes in like an ontological sense. That's what like there's in my understanding of that is like apropos the unconscious, that the negative has like an ontological salience in that regard.
Yeah. And so like this is the way that the psyche operates. So like the unconscious content will affirm itself, but it is the ego, its defense, that inverts it into a negative totality. And so this is what Lacan finds interesting. So a polemic to sort of get at not only ego psychologists by privileging the ego as something to look at and not the ego as defended against the unconscious, he develops his structural model. Again, now we get to get at this imaginary, symbolic, and the real. So Lacan in Seminar 1 talks about this model called the optical schema, or the inverted bouquet. So if anybody's heard of the inverted bouquet, it's a famous experiment that people used in optics and classical physics, where you have a bouquet where it's like, okay, I don't have like a vase or flowers, but like you would have a box that's like a sort of transparent box. There would be flowers sticking out of it, but the vase is upside down inside the interior of the box. And so in front of that, there is a revolving concave mirror. And so when you're at a precise geometrical location, that the light that hits that mirror and hits that inverted bouquet will then create an illusory real image of a vase with flowers inside, right? So what this is for Lacan is a way to structurally describe the inauguration of the ego, right? This is also Freud's theory of narcissism, meaning that what makes humans different from animals is that our sexuality, our sexual development, isn't predicated on, reproduction. That is actually ancillary or secondary. The image and the way that Freud or Lacan will use this is this image, this optical schema, is really interesting because he compares it back to the animal kingdom. So when you look at mating rituals in animals, they rely on a specular lure. So like praying mantises, they get hypnotized by the sort of colorful gaze and lure of the female praying mantis. Spiders, I think, do the same thing. There is this ritual that this predatory fish called the stickleback does, where they start to like sprout their and these like spikes on their back, and they do this dance and they start digging holes into the sand whenever they see their mate. So these are specular imaginary images that animals and the animal kingdom use to mate, and obviously in the sexual mating they reproduce the species, right? So the imaginary is definitely a part of the animal kingdom, and they use it temporarily to be able to reproduce their species. We, on the other hand, do not do that for mating. We actually use this imaginary lure based upon our failed nature to inaugurate ourselves, right? So our identity, our ego is actually sexually constructed by this lure. We hold on to the lure. So the infamous mirror stage is the lure that the animals use, but we use it because it is the structuration of our being, our ego, which is an illness, pretty much a pathology. It's pathologically constructed. So this lure is the ego, and then what Lacan does is then like goes on to talk about, okay, so this experiment tells us, like, it shows us structurally how the lure functions to structure our ego. To translate it into everyday language, what I'm saying is that we live in a society that is structured around networks of symbolic orders, signs and signifiers, demands and codes and culture. And so the law of society, this big other, or the imperatives that we are given by our parents operate in the same way. And so our identity, our ego is structured in that way. Where we position ourselves, we then construct our mirror stage, our ego, from that lure of the demand of the other. And so what that means is that, our caregivers are the ones that, are constantly like projecting, oh, you're such a beautiful kid, you're such a good kid, or like, you're a brat or whatever, like all these sorts of things that are put onto us then inaugurate the ego from, these sort of points and positions that we're from. So I only talked about the ego, but this mathematical formula of the optical schema to translate into Lacanian terms are the way in which we're already thrown into a symbolic order, but we haven't been interpolated into the symbolic or represented by the symbolic. So it appears to us in this imaginarized form via the other, right? And so we develop our sort of libidinal investment, our sexual instincts from that lure. So then once we become symbolized as speaking beings, we develop what is called the ego ideal, right? It's where this lure, this narcissistic image, kind of becomes one of where we're not invested by our bodily image into actually the world around us, right? And so Lacan will juxtapose that from what's his name? He's a zoologist, Uxkel. He's a German zoologist who's looking at, like, the way organisms develop their world. And so, like, you could think of this as like we are developing our outer world, the Umwelt, and our inner world, the Innenwelt. Prior to this mirror stage, there is no reality, right? Or reality proper, as we would think it. There is just a pure external world, no differentiation, right? It is the introduction of the symbolic in its imaginarized form through the ego in this mirror stage that we then develop a distinction between the interior and the exterior, right? And how we do that is through the way in which, again, I mentioned verneinung, negation. There is this concept in Freud called the pleasure ego, right? So as little kids, as babies, we are developing this notion of what is good for my interior thing and what is bad. The original concept that Freud used, which is bastardized by, like, theorists that Lacan is polemicizing, is called reality testing. And so we reality test by taking in what is good and projecting out as what is bad. This is I, this is not I, right? And it is through a sort of encounter with something traumatic that will then constitute, not only our symbolic order, but also what becomes repressed about this moment, right? So the ego acts as a sort of misrecognition and a defense against what we repressed and encounter as traumatic, right?
And is this also why, Andrew, you mentioned that this is in some sense pathological? It's like that what the ego does.
Yeah, because the ego is a misrecognition of what it sort of encounters, and what I mean by misrecognition is like not only does the ego develop the subject of the unconscious, which is what we're getting at, right? But sort of to kind of protect itself, the ego also arises as a symptom, as a defense. And as early as this essay called Function in the Field of Language in Psychoanalysis, Lacan will say, I think very early on, that the ego should not be taken as the modus operandi of like psychoanalysis. This was not Freud's project. What these analysts are doing by fixing the ego is actually just reorienting the symptom in a new way, because what the ego is a fantasy producing machine. Like that's
Yeah,
what
I
he
mean,
kind of says
I'll
is.
make like a very trite comment here. This is why, like I've heard when I'm speaking to Lacanians, especially who are analysts, that have someone who had OCD or something. They were doing something with their fingers, and then they'd go do some kind of CBT based therapy, and then they'll give up that symptom, or like that symptom ends, but then it'll show up as, I don't know, you become a CrossFitter or alcoholic. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it
Like
it's
all you're really doing, yeah, is just like throwing your symptom out the front door and then letting it back in through the back door for the
that's
most
it.
part.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and so like I'm kind of like speaking fast, I'm kind of throwing a lot, but like kind of slow down a bit. Like this is like the problem of the ego, because the ego is always the sort of defense, and it will do so much to reorient and not realize like what it's like sort of defending against. And the main thing that comes with this concept of misrecognition, what it's doing is misunderstanding the sort of knowledge of the symptom
Mm,
by
yeah.
tending it. But it's
Sure.
also because it's dealing with this image, it's alienation, right? It is like an alienating factor, because it doesn't just rely upon I see myself in the mirror. Rather, the mirror is like a metaphor, right? What we're really talking about with this mirror stage concept is really that it is spawned by the sort of discourse of the other. Of course, it's through the language of the other in a sort of um, imaginarized form, but it hasn't fully become symbolically constituted as a sort of network, right? And so the symbolic for Lacan, so the imaginary for Lacan is the introduction of the ego. It is the structure of the ego. It is the way that the ego understands itself and the way that it relies upon being mirrored by others and their language. And language has an imaginary form. Think of it in like auditory forms, the way that we kind of have a perception of sounds and all that. Lacan makes a thing about like, okay, like we can look at like deaf mutes, right? They can't speak, and yet like they have sign language. Right? This is a sort of symbolic act, but they can't make out the sort of symbolic articulations and sequences because they're so lost by the beautiful hands that make these gestures. So that's in a way that even communication has an imaginary form. uh, the symbolic aspect of language is, I think I said it earlier, it's just laws, it's codes, it's contracts, it's a form of writing. These constitute and describe, the very characteristics of the symbolic. For the early seminars, at least for seminar one, the symbolic is speech. He's dealing with forms of speech and forms of language. Uh, he focuses on an analytic philosopher to kind of prove his point about the emphasis of speech in psychoanalysis. It's How to Do Things with Words by J.L. Austin. There's a sort of performativity to words in which, like, when you say, like, in your wedding vows, I do, there's a performativity that goes on with that symbolic gesture. Or if I'm at the dinner table and I don't see the salt around, and then I see it all the way over at the end of the table, I go, oh, there's the salt. There's a symbolic code that comes with that. That's like, okay, pass the salt, back to me. These ways in which symbolic articulation of a language and speech have an announcement to it, a broadcasting. And so, in a way, we need to pay attention to language and its sort of symbolic articulations, and what the patient is producing in their speech, because that's what's important. And
Yeah,
so,
Can I interrupt for a bit? Sorry, Andrew. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts here. There is, I think of the symbolic, the Lacanian symbolic that we're just in a bit more too simplistic way, because I connect this to the Heideggerian notion of thrownness, where you're kind of thrown into the world, to a world of signifiers and symbolic meaning. You're already, for example, Leon Brenner makes this point that you're kind of for Lacanians, you're kind of pre-born into this world. You're born into a given. You're already given a name. Most people before they're born, you have a surname in certain patriarchal cultures. And then, of course, you're born into a certain nation, culture, whatnot. But I'm assuming, that is that too simplistic to view the symbolic in that way?
I would say yes. And also, I have a lot of, I cringe my teeth when, not at you, at like when people want to connote Heidegger and Lacan on the same lines.
I,
And of
I
course,
agree.
Lacan has a history of reading Heidegger and even translating some of Heidegger's texts. He was well fluent in reading German and writing German. He just couldn't speak it. And I know he's hung out with Heidegger a couple of times. With that being said, the symbolic order is not a referential totality of signs in the way that Lacan or Heidegger will say about it in Being and Time. It is not something that is present to hand or ready to hand. It is not something that could be understood or grasped in a phenomenological way. In fact, everything that Heidegger says about this referential totality of signs can be an imaginarized version of what is symbolic. All right. When I
Okay.
talked about speech, so let's say that what I was just describing is an imaginarized form of the symbolic still, that the ego is comprehending, a sort of totality, something that's totalized, something that we can understand. But Lacan's point is that there's something that still escapes that mirror image, right?
Yeah.
In the optical schema, because this mirror image is an inverted totality. Because prior to fixating on that image, I don't have a bouquet. I have something that's inverted and incomplete, just fragmented. But once I stand in that position, I get a fixed illusion that I have a totality that is based upon an inversion, right? And so as in these early seminars, Lacan is dealing with two things. He calls it empty speech and full speech. Now, here's the thing. He does reference Heidegger in terms of empty speech. He says that empty speech can be likened to das Man, or idle chatter. But full speech is what we encountered in this example of, before I tell you about this dream about this woman, let me tell you that this was not my mother, right? This sort of linguistic crisscrossing of the way that speech fails, in which I start to speak so much that I become silent once I get at a breaking point in my analysis about myself. We get at the unconscious. So full speech is the unconscious, and it's something that escapes an imaginarized form and requires a sort of symbolic articulation. So what does that mean? And I know we are only talking about the symbolic. We got to get about the real. I think the real for Lacan in as early as Seminar 1 is predicated on this notion of the real image that escapes the this optical schema. I want to talk about Seminar 2 because this is where we kind of get a huge articulation of what we're talking about. What is beautiful about Seminar 2 is we also get into the death drive. I feel like Lacan was really talking about the ego only to sort of be like, this is why we don't talk about the ego, or why we're not focused on the ego. So he still talks about his idea about the ego being a misrecognition. He wants to talk about the unconscious subject. And you being in a computer program, you'll definitely love this, because he talks about cybernetics a lot and wants to juxtapose the symbolic order to something like a machine, a
Yeah.
cybernetic machine. And interesting to think about machines for Lacan is that they break down. They break down because of a something that is real, that is embedded into its own logic, right? And so if we have to talk about the symbolic order, not language, but the way that the symbolic order is instantiated, it has rules, it has a logic. And we could simplify this logic to a 0 and a 1. You just need a 0 and a 1 and reproduce that and get some inputs and outputs, and you have a system, right? We see that as simple as a switch. If you have a 0 and a 1, you have on and off, you have closed and open, right? And so you just need that. He likens this to, again, we're getting into now, so sur, the signifier, right? So for him, the signifier, and this is both in seminar 2 and 3, is different from, again, a Heideggerian referential totality, and even the original Saussure's notion of the signifier, which is this binary relation of a sign. A sign is both composed of the signifier, an audio image, and the thing that is signified. Cat, the audio image, and then the signified would be the cat itself. I don't think it has to do with anything with a physical cat, but the concept of cat. Lacan is saying that, well, okay, the sign for Saussure has a referent, right? Cat and the thing that is referred to as cat. Then you have that, and then you have natural signs, right, which have a referent. So for instance, if I see smoke, that indicates that there is a fire. So that you have a natural sign and a referent, right? Or certain birds or whatever, they have a referent that it's time for mating season, so their color changes. That again is a natural sign. And then you have a trace in which there may be nothing present at the moment, but these traces lead to a referent. The signifier for Lacan, which deals with the subject of the unconscious, has a trace, but does not have a referent, right? So this is why the symbolic order is composed of 0 and 1, or 1 and 0, 0 and 1, presence and absence and presence. This isn't anything new, even though I'm saying new terms. This goes back to our concept of negation or Verneinung. What is being affirmed is affirmed in a negation, but also what is being inaugurated from the unconscious is something that doesn't exist, but is something that is echoing something from the subject's past, right? That is being presented to us, right? So that is sort of how it enters into a sort of quote unquote symbolic network. And it repeats because of, and fails because of the death drive, right? That is something that is introduced in seminar 2 that is different from seminar 1. And so for Lacan in seminar 2, he wants to really double down on this notion of plus and minus, because this is what his signifier will entail in his later years, and especially why, even though the thing fails, it continues to keep on going and continue to break down. Because what he says in seminar 16 about the symbolic order, he gives us a nice definition. He says the symbolic order can be defined as this. It is an accumulation. It is an arrangement, an enumeration, that somewhere there is a count. And when there is a count, there is an ordering and there is a symbolic system. So what is that that's being ordering? It's something that has to do with the concept that we're familiar with, jouissance, or for Freud, it is sexual libido, right? It is the id, it is the unconscious, and some of it is ordered through the signifier. And while that sounds like very vague, we could put it into simple terms that when I free associate and I continue to stumble upon these, free associative insights, the full speech, what I'm doing is encountering a deadlock, encountering what we talked about earlier as impasses and formalization, right? Now we've marked that down and we've enumerated, we've accumulated, right? And so the death drive isn't repetition, but the death drive is, the sort of failure to totalize, and we have an incompleteness, but the ability to repeat is the ability
failure, right? Yeah, it's failure. Yeah.
It is an operation. It is a unary operation.
Yeah. In fact, can I just make this point here? I don't know if this makes sense to you. I've been thinking about something Callum Neal wrote recently, where in some sense you can speak of desire still in a very utilitarian kind of way, where yes, you're desiring a virtual objet for sure. Your desire can never be complete or be fulfilled. but nonetheless, it is somewhat utilitarian where you still think by getting the object, by acquiring the object, your lack will be filled or you can overcome your barred subjectivity. But I find that the drive is, in its truest sense, non-utilitarian because what you enjoy is the repetition of a failure or a repetition of the deadlock. I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah, and maybe I think right here I should probably get into like what I was saying, how I'd orient my talk would be like concerning these concepts. So
Sure.
I mentioned the transference, and I really think no matter what, it's just like you'd have to read Lacan to really understand, because like I guess like this is like even like his students like Laplanche and Pontalis would say that like the transference is like the one concept and fundamental concept in Freudian Lacanian psychoanalysis that no matter what, how much clinical detail we have, is the hardest to define. But as simple as we could put it, it's just like the subject supposed to know. It is like the desire for a subject supposed to know. It is also something that, you know, it brings the analytic session into fruition. And so the other fundamental concept would be the unconscious, right? The unconscious that's structured like a language. It is a real thing. It is real, or not thing, but it is real in the you know Lacanian sense of the three registers, that it is structured upon impossibility, the impossibility to say it all, the impossibility to formalize it into a language. Um, and the other concept is the drive, right? You mentioned that, and I think it's important that we say that, because we shouldn't assume that people that are watching this know exactly what we're talking about. And you
That's
know,
kind of why I
the
brought it
drive
up.
is another thing. So one of the things that is crucial to understand is not only in as far as seminar two, as far as like something that breaks down the symbolic order, and something that Freud discovered in his text called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Um, it's something that he talked about as early as this 1917, and depending on even Lacan will say, oh no, it's earlier in another 1895 project. But in this paper called Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, or Drives in Their Destiny, Freud is really scientific right here, because he talks about like we always think that science is always about like, you know, getting at the heart of the facts and starting from clear cut things that we empirically start off with. But even science starts off from the most abstract, right? Nothing. I mean, it's almost in a sense kind of like similar to sense certainty in Hegel's phenomenology, where we think that the most immediate thing is actually an abstraction. And so, like for Freud, the most abstract thing that science is dealing with in certain things like biology and physiology is the concept of the instinct, right? This thing that we take as, you know, apodictic, that we take as like, you know, sense certainty, is actually not at all that. And so he wants to reformulate this notion of the instinct, or as it's actually tried, intrigue, the drive, um, that it has nothing to do with some type of internal stimuli of like, you know, some like somatic thing. It's not to say it's not without it, but like you can't reduce it down to that. It isn't like this simple as like pleasure and pain, although those do tie into that. But for him, he structures this notion of drive, which is tied to his theory of libido, which is sexual, to something that could be split down into four elements. So for the drive, its elements are an initial thrust, you know, something that propels, something that has an aim, something that has an object, and something that has a source, right? So these are the four ways in which the drive is structured. And I think, like from my understanding, right, the source I think comes from the sort of understanding of libido, because it's not instinctual towards sexuality. And if it were instinctual, we wouldn't be developing our egos. The ego, you know, is something that is not purely instinctual from a sort of natural law type thing. And nor is like this sort of ego and narcissism. Of course, for Freud, in order to not fall into the sort of Jungian panpsychism of universalizing psychic energy, he splits his theory of libido of sexual instinct, which even though it is libidinal, still aims at the sexual reproduction and also some form of satisfaction. And then the ego drive or ego libido, or you'll say libido instincts and ego instincts, depending on what translation or what essay you're reading. But it's same nonetheless. But I think for Lacan, though, because he's able to reorient like the theory of libido and the ego and all that with this optical schema, it's pretty much one and the same. And what I mean is that like there is no like sort of naturalized sexual like instinct. Everything is pretty much like oriented around like this libidinal investment. So what I mean by that is like everything is sublimating, like we are sort of elevating the sort of instinct to something different. So not only are there 4 elements to the drive, there are 4 ways in which this drive takes on its destiny, right? Transforms itself. So it can reverse into its opposite. And Freud will use the term like, okay, if you have a drive to love and can never get that, well, then it'll turn into hate. Or like if you have this sort of sadistic tendency and can't get that, then it turns masochistic or something like. So he gives that as like a sort of colloquial example. Then it could also take on the form of like the subject. And I think in the sense that the drive can manifest as satisfying itself onto the subject is in the way that we get the ego, we get the narcissistic investment. This is my reading of Freud from the Lacanian sense, that these problems that Freud was able to identify, you couldn't really synthesize it and to see like how these things functioned. Then you get repression. So you can't get that because of some exterior law or something that you've internalized. And I think that repression comes from the ego, right? The ego, which is a sublimatory effect. It is, an investment. It is also, a repressive manner. And then for Freud, you have sublimation proper. But for Lacan, the drive, he points out that the drive, if it aims at satisfaction, sublimation itself is satisfaction, because you are, still getting that satisfaction. And what I mean, because like for Freud, all right, you have a sexual impulse, and because of culture and because of societal norms, you can't express that. So maybe you're not even sex, but like, let's say like because of society and like you're angry at somebody, but you can't hit them and you want to hit them so bad. And this is very like, a kind of like stereotypical example. What you do is you punch the bag instead, and that's like your form of sublimating aggression. What Lacan would say is that like sublimation and satisfaction of the drive are one and the same. In fact, it's like, one of the things that the drive does, it sublimates, it gets repressed, it enjoys itself as a subject, etc. Like he's saying that like, pretty much, and this is coming from like Seminar 11, where he'll make this funny notion, saying that like, he says it in Seminar 7, saying that like there is no difference between sexuality and sublimation, that we get sexuality because of sublimation, that culture itself is sexualized. Like we don't have sex and then we have culture that represses it. No, it is because of a culture that is, repressive, that we have sexuality. And then if we have a permissive culture, we have a culture that is super egoically enjoying too much, and, or wanting to enjoy too much, but you can never enjoy enough. And the Slovene school loves to talk
That's
about
a very Zizek'ian, yeah. I think
it's a very Zizek'ian.
yeah, super ego commandment is enjoy. Yeah.
So and so like I'm throwing a lot out, but what I'm saying is like, to understand this theory of drive, I'm juxtaposing Freud to Lacan, because what Lacan wants to do is make drive the central thesis of the Freudian doctrine. Or not the central thesis, but like the sort of the fundamental concept, because no Freudian around the time of Freud, or like after Freud, or even around Lacan's time, were utilizing the theory of the death drive. He thought that the theory of the death drive was crucial to Freud. And well, what does that mean? What is the death drive? Well, it's the fact that in your sort of ability to aim at satisfaction, you undermine yourself. You end up at an impetus, right? You end up, not getting the thing that satisfies you, or you get the thing, and in the process, you destroy yourself, to kind of say it theatrically. You don't literally destroy yourself, but it's like you're never satisfied, right?
Yeah,
And so,
I would say here, since we've mentioned some books before, Adrian Johnston's book Infinite Greed, where he kind of uses this notion of the drive to analyze the capitalist subject, is just I think one of the best books I've read on the topic. Like he really brings it to light, this notion of like how you yeah, it's because the problem is it's not as simple as saying it's almost like a masochistic fantasy where you enjoy pain, and it's not that simple. It's rather it's which is why I prefer to say it's like a repetition of failure. That's where the jouissance lies, in the drive. I mean, at least that's my understanding of it.
yeah. So we could get into jouissance and the way that it takes on its form in Lacan throughout the seminars. But yeah, like it's as simple as like, so it is this failure, it is this undermining. And it's funny that you mentioned Adrian Johnston's Infinite Greed. I haven't read it. I've listened to a lot of his talks regarding Lacan, Freud, and Marx. And I think like this ability to like psychoanalyze a political economy has some like utility to like understanding how these concepts like play out. And Zizek talks about this. Adrian definitely agrees, and Lacan definitely coins this term too. That Freud didn't invent the symptom, Marx did. And so, like, if you look at Capital, Volume One, there is this example where he talks about like the difference between the capitalist and the miser. Like the miser, in fear of losing all his money, hoards it all, but then like undermines himself in the process, and then like has no more money or like loses it all. Whereas like the capitalist is a smart miser, a reasonable miser, in which like in order for them to get more money, they toss it out and they bring it back in extra. And why money is this useful like a analogy, or maybe even homology with drive, is because it is excess, it is pure exchange. Like we don't use money, we exchange money. And Lacan talks about this in seminar 16, right? If I have a factory and I have these containers of oil, if they're in the factory overnight, they have no use value. They're completely there for exchange. But
Mm.
once exchange them, I exchange them, and then their use value becomes sort of exemplified. Like, I exchange them so that they can be used for a person that bought them. But the thing is that money has no use value. It's only there for exchanging of commodities and being the universal equivalent of all commodities if you're like a Marxist about it. But the point is then, okay, if that's the case, why is money in safes then? If they're meant for exchange, why do we put them in safes? That is like sort of Lacan's whole notion to get at. Well, it's because it's exactly what we do. We hoard, we multiply in excess, and then exert it all out. This is what the whole thing about the drive does. It's all about excess, exertion, discharge, decay, and spoliation, right? That's the main thing about the drive. If it is the death drive, that it has no, it doesn't work, right? And we can see this in many ways in capitalism outside of the psychoanalytic use of it, is like Starbucks, for example, like at the end of the night, like all their sort of pastries and like paninis that they have on display, they have to throw that all out, and they can't take it home. They can't feed it to any homeless person that's right there. They'll get in trouble. So like all that they can't sell, they have to throw out, right? So it's like drive is not just this destructive thing, it's this accumulative and excessive thing that also just has to be rejected.
Yeah, I mean, I'll also say this. One brilliance of Marxian theory is that the analysis and the critique was done on the level of the surplus, right? This excess. And I think that's why, as long as capitalism stays, there'll always be Marxism too, because the problems are being analyzed at the proper level, at the correct level of analysis.
Yeah, and not even talking in Marxism, I'm talking more like Lacan's reading of Marx in Seminar 16, and some Marxists will like kind of like say like, oh, this is not surplus value, this is Lacan's reading. Like I'm not even worried about that, but like, yeah, I agree with you. And I think like this use of Marx kind of like like illustrates the way in which drive can be thought of differently than like the way that like a client would think of like the Freud's use of the death drive as this aggressive thing that's destructive. Like in a sense, yes, it is destructive, but not in the way that like a Kleinian would like see it as aggression. The child's death drive comes when because they're aggressive and they want to just like destroy the mother's breast when they feed. It's not at all what the death drive is. And so to go back to Freud, and this will help align back with what I was talking about with the symbolic order about presence and absence, plus and minus. So Freud evokes this concept of the death drive with his notion of the pleasure principle, because Freud splits up the psyche with these two fundamental principles, pleasure principle and reality principle. We aim at pleasure, or, and one of the things that, Freud was really interested in was to develop a psychic model based off energetics, right? And thermodynamics. People always criticize Freud for being biologistic. No, he was using thermodynamics. He was using energetics. And this is why Lacan likes that and likens his signifier along the same lines as energetics. So Freud would say that, the pleasure principle aims at homeostasis, right? And it operates in this law of constancy. Due to entropy and all that, it has to be able to discharge this excess that doesn't work. And the reality principle puts this harsh sort of limit on the pleasure principle from taking place. So the pleasure principle has to operate around that. So you have this internal excitation that needs to be discharged, but then also the harsh energetic input by the reality principle onto the organism. So he has to operate around that, right? Done deal, right? Then we have a way to operate through the pleasure principle through the reality principle. But what Freud says is that, like, in his discovery of the death drive, that the pleasure principle can never reach homeostasis, right? It is always sort of undermined by that, and not even by the reality principle, but by the pleasure principle itself. And he gives this example of his grandson to kind of illustrate how it operates. Yeah. It's the famous Fort Da. Yeah. And so the example is that, like, he's supposed to watch his grandson while his daughter leaves the grandson with him. Didn't cry, stayed in like his cradle and everything, and didn't show any sort of distress at all. But then he starts, like, over time, when the mom would hand him to Freud and then leave, start making these noises like ooh and ah, like these at like this the most random times. And then he would start to do this thing by translating these phonemes into a game where he would throw the toy and then refine it only to do it again. And then they would translate into fort, which is, I believe, like German to like cast away, and da to refine it. And so this is the way in which he is trying to master the scene of separation, right? And the way that the drive sublimates to these different symbolic games in order to repeat and fail. And why it's not find but refined is because you're constantly trying to find the object, and then it's like, no, that's not it. But this also goes back to a theme in Freud's early 3 essays of sexuality, where he says that, the sexual object is always a refining of the object. So it's like according to Lacan, he's thinking about the death drive without realizing it as early as like this essay and other essays where he's formulating his theory of the instinct, the libido, the drive, and aligning it to this notion of pleasure principle and reality reality principle. So it's actually the pleasure principle that is this sort of limit, not the reality principle. The reality principle is the pleasure principle, but the pleasure principle is, this impossibility because we can never aim at homeostasis. We're always sort of maneuvering through, discharging excess stuff that doesn't work. And so to go back to thermodynamics, what that means, like in this model, is that you have energy that cannot operate in the system, so it has to be jettisoned. It has to be discharged. As an electrician who used to work on generators, our generators had what was called the 0.8 power factor, meaning that we only utilized 80% of the energy that we produce. So 100, we never use 100% of it. 20% of it was excess that couldn't make it within the circuit. So it just like dissipates. So like that is in a way that we see like entropy sort of operate like that. And so like what we're doing is we're only utilizing stuff that, can operate, and the excess sort of has to get tossed out, but it always comes back. What is repressed always comes back. Our symptoms always come back. And so this ties into jouissance, because jouissance for Lacan is not, it's not enjoyment, right?
Yeah, very important.
We like to think it is enjoyment, but it's loss, right? And I will also tie in objet a, because objet a becomes plus de jouir, or surplus jouissance, in seminar 16 and 18. A surplus is always what is taken away, or a surplus is always what cannot be used in the system. So objet a, the cause of my desire, is also a loss, something that doesn't work, but can only appear as something that in this whole of the system that is my psyche appears as a fantasy. That is what jouissance is. And jouissance has a repetition factor. Again, I was talking about this unary operation. This is what is called the unary trait that comes up in Freud as in his essay Group Psychology. But I mention this because this unary trait marks the subject, right? So let's go back to what I was saying in my earlier talk about seminar 1, and this whole thing about the mirror stage, right? So we're in this imaginary domain, right? Now it is to be sort of interpolated in the symbolic, if you want to use that term, or represented by the symbolic, into where we're symbolic beings. There is this term that is used in Lacanian theory called castration, right? You're probably familiar with it. And that means to be subjects, at least symbolically, or at least represented. And it is through this term, the name of the Father, right? So what I'm getting at in talking about this unary trait is also to talk about Freud's infamous but also misunderstood concept called the Oedipus complex. Yeah. So what the Oedipus complex is all right, so you have this myth that the baby is taken care of by the mother. They have this narcissistic image that is sort of projected onto them that they begin to sort of be lured by. And what this is the sort of mother's desire implanted onto them. Their gaze, their love for the baby, that is also the substitute for their lack of the sort of thing that they desire, right? And the baby then realizes that there is a hole, not a little, not a literal hole, but it's like the fact that the mother desires something that isn't me, right? And I can't give it to her. And so this is a moment of, in a sense, castration, or in a moment of encountering that, but it isn't fully castration. Castration is when you are able to be interpolated and given something as a substitute, with the fact that not only do you lack and your mother lacks, but you can't give them that. And so this is where the introduction of what is called the name of the Father comes in, which is a signifier. And this also is when the baby, or the child, the boy, or the little girl, whatever you want, is sort of going through this sort of stage of puberty as well. And they develop sexually, biologically, but then also sexually, sort of libidinally, is when the signifier inaugurates itself as the name of the father. And what this means is that this signifier, which is one of prohibition, one that is a prohibition that is a cultural and social thing, not just like a sort of individualistic familial thing, but it of course is in the sight of the family. This name of the father is also the no of the father because it is prohibited. But then the castrating part is what's called the phallic function. And what this means, and this is Lacan's use of it, because for Freud, one of his errors is that he thought the phallus was the actual penis. No, the phallic function is the sort of extension and consubstantial thing of the signifier called the phallus. And actually, the mirror stage image is actually produced because of that phallic function, which is a signifier. So it is supposed to be the enjoyment of also the name of the father too. So the boy will rival with the mother, or no, rival with the father because they want to be embedded in this narcissistic investment with their mother and the mother's love, right? This sort of imaginary incubescent thing. But the name of the father individuates them. For the little girl, they already identify with this side of castration and want to be sort of the thing, the phallus itself, right?
Yeah, I mean,
and
they say it's because the little girl doesn't have a penis envy, right? But then that's, of course, in a symbolic sense.
yeah, and that's like, yeah, I know Mari Rudy writes a lot about that.
Yeah.
And I don't know how she like kind of reorients that in a sort of like existential and even like not like a feminist critique, but I think a new feminist reading of Lacan. But yeah, like the classical Freudian thing would be like, yeah, penis envy. But it's more of like the way that sexuality and libido, well, one, it is structured phallically, but for the woman, right, they are not fully interpolated within this phallic field, and so this is why they're so sort of different. And this is why, like Lacan, many will be like, oh, Lacan is phallogocentric, and all that. Like, no, he's actually saying like something that's actually radical, that women are not,
in fact, yeah, they aren't caught up like idiot men in the phallus. Yeah.
So why I'm bringing like the Oedipus complex up is because I'm trying to talk about this notion of the unary trait, right? And this notion of the unary trait is the mark, which is the subject, right? It's the mark of the subject. And it is like, so this whole thing shouldn't be taken literally. This is a myth. It is Freud's myth. And Lacan will say that Oedipus is Freud's myth, right? It is Freud's dream. And we're using this sort of thing to talk about what Freud, as the scientist who was trying to inaugurate something that could be a science. And Freud, the scientist, was operating in not only the ideals of science, but also trying to find an ideal science. And so by wrestling with Freud's unconscious, we're also creating a sort of structure for psychoanalysis to operate, because one of the major things that Freud discovered was the unconscious, but that the unconscious has a sexual component to it. That sexuality is the core of the unconscious, but, sexuality is, and that's kind of like sort of contradiction, because there is no core to sexuality. It's an impossible thing. But this whole myth is the sort of way in which the subject comes into being by this castrating thing. They're marked, right? And so the mark of the subject must be represented by the signifier, right? The name of the father and the phallus are able to mark that subject, but the subject needs a signifier, right? And then it relates to the other signifier. Now we're getting into this whole thing of how to understand, I guess, not only the symbolic, but also the real in a different light, because of course this whole thing about plus and minus still operates into what I'm explaining right now. The signifier has this plus and minus presence and absence thing is because it's able to represent the unconscious subject, right, in the analytic session. And so Lacan's whole axiom is signifier represents the subject for another signifier.
Right. Yeah.
And so the signifier doesn't have a referent, right? It's representing the subject, but the subject is always absent, right? But the subject leaves a mark, it leaves a trace, right? And the subject is always trying to, via the signifier, account for itself in this sort of process. The signifying chain is the sort of chain of repression, right? To account for this cause of itself, this inaugural moment from the castration, the Oedipal the process. This myth, this signifying moment, is the unconscious working itself out via free association, via the dream, and via the fantasy of its own cause, of its own history, of its own past, pretty much. That's pretty much what we've been talking about from seminar 1 to seminar 2 in different terms, and pretty much what he's constantly getting at in new ways. And you'll like this, because this is the whole thing about analytic philosophy, is because his theory of the signifier is different from Saussure, because he thinks the unconscious is actually the incarnation of the Russell's paradox. He says that the Russell's paradox, and I've also talking about this from colleagues that are Lacanians, who, if people want to view my channel, The Vanishing Mediators, we had this one talk with Paris Levitas. He's actually a colleague of Lorenzo Chiesa, and he says, like, I think it's as early as seminar 9, that the Russell's paradox is not really a paradox at all, because it can be written, right? There's nothing paradoxical about it, but it's when we use sense and sensibility to talk about it and formalize it into language that then we start to have trouble and it appears paradoxical. But for a psychoanalyst, for Lacan, it's like, no, it's not a paradox because it can't be written. And his whole thing of the signifier represents the subject for another signifier is his variation of the Russell's paradox. So what is the Russell's paradox? I mean, I'll explain it, even though I probably shouldn't have to, because I know your viewers have probably watched a lot of your analytic philosophy. Well, this thing has to do with set theory and the fact of, hopefully I'm not butchering it, but it's like, you have a set, right? And a set is pretty much of anything, like any sort of member that doesn't contain itself or represent itself.
Yeah, so like there's a set. So a set can be a set of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, of numbers.
But like, let's say Russell posits, if there's a set that contains any sets that don't contain themselves, does that set contain itself? So it creates a problem of self-reference. But I think a more intuitive way to understand it is in a simple way. And here's where, this is really interesting on what you said, where when you put it into like language, it becomes a paradox, is that if there's a barber that shaves people who don't shave themselves, does the barber shave himself? So then you see the paradox really appear. But anyway, in simple terms.
Yeah. And exactly. And this is what we're getting at with formalizing the unconscious, because this notion, the signifier represents the subject for another signifier, right? So you have the signifier, which is, I don't know if you could see it, probably not.
Yes,
but
I'll be doing a lot of graphics on this. So
okay, maybe we could do it later. But like, I don't have
because this is very
so
good.
you have the same logic kind of play out. You have a signifier S who represents the subject for another signifier, right? And Lacan will liken the other signifier as the letter capital A, meaning the big other, the locus of signifiers, right? The battery bank of all signifiers. Because one of the things is that signifiers for Lacan don't refer to a referent. They refer to other signifiers for their meaning.
So it does refer to a referent. Yeah.
Exactly. And the subject has no existence. It has being because of the signifier. So things could be without existing because of the signifier, and that's because of names, right? And so the signifier addresses A, right? So you have S addressing A, just a signifier. But right there is already A, because A is the battery bank of all signifiers, right? Signifiers that do not represent themselves, right? So A would be the set of all signifiers that do not represent themselves, where S, the signifier, is the set of all sets of signifiers that do not represent themselves, right? But the problem is, okay, so that first S is the signifier that represents the subject, but is also the set that will contain all sets that do not contain themselves, right? And A is the big other, which is the battery bank and the locus of all signifiers of that. Yeah. And so the paradox is, or at least the contradiction is that, well, this set cannot contain itself. We run into this real antagonism because the subject is what is being represented, right? The subject is counting, but cannot account for itself in the totality of the process. So what this means is that we have formalized an impossibility, an impasse. To me, right here, this is Lacan's way of not only mathematizing, right, but also like trying to formalize a language to talk about what is going on with the unconscious when we speak about it, right? Because it's the unconscious subject trying to count and account for itself, right? And so because of that impossibility to account for itself, we get this famous S1, right? S1 is already a mathem that represents the impasse of formalization, right? Of a signifier addressing another signifier, right? A closed set and an open void set, right? And then S2 is the sort of mathem for an impasse of A, right? What this means is that, well, we have a barred subject, a split subject, the unconscious subject, who needs a signifier to represent itself to another signifier, but this other, which contains the sort of signifiers of knowledge, is inconsistent and also a whole. How can we illustrate this? Well, Descartes, the founder of modern science, and this is why Lacan loves Descartes so much, but also Pascal. I'm riffing off Seminar 16. Descartes wants to know if he can know anything, and if not, if the demon is not, deceiving him, he relies on the other, right? And he relies on God, who can guarantee the field of all knowledge with truth and certainty, right?
Yeah, I mean, he even says God does not deceive.
Yeah, God does not deceive, right? Yeah. And whereas Schreber, the psychotic, will wonder if God is deceiving him. Pascal, on the other hand, is kind of different, where he is anti-philosophical, and also he is in this sort of weird position because of rise of modern science, the decline of the Augustinian worldview, and also in the rise of capitalism, even though he probably would not, think of capitalism like we think of capitalism or even talk about capitalism. The point is that there's a dying world, and the relevance of God, and he's criticizing the God of philosophers who use them only to talk about nothing. And so he develops this wager, right? Pascal's wager of, which is basically not that like proving if God exists, but if I could have a good life or not, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly why he's called a proto-existentialist, because it's the notion of forget about God, what about me?
Exactly, right. Yeah. But what makes this interesting, though, is that his God, and Lacan will say this, is not the God of the philosophers and cannot be understood that way, and therefore he's not caught in this imaginary understanding of the God of the philosophers, whose God of the philosophers is predicated on. Rather, we're dealing with the real, because we are wagering and we are encountering an other. And this also must be taken into account based upon Pascal's use of Jansenism, because he was a Jansenist. And what that means is that Jansenism is a form of like weird Catholicism, where this guy named Jansen, who I guess it was a polemic he had with Jesuits, and uncovered a text that was this sort of debate that Augustine had with another theologian named Pelagius on the notion of grace, right? And there was like the fact that an original sin. So Augustine believed in original sin, that we were born into sin, but that we could be saved through God's grace, right? And that requires not only work, but our faith in performing God's will. Whereas Pelagius believed that we, can free will ourselves. There is no original sin, but we could free will ourselves into grace, that we did not rely on God's will purely on that, or pretty much we don't need to rely purely on God's will, that we have our own free will, and because God gave us free will, we can exercise that on alone to achieve grace. So this was an interesting theological debate. So why does that have to do with Pascal and Jansenism? Well, for Jansen, this became a sort of question and concerning God. And if I understand my history of theology right, Jansenism has this sort of despairing worldview that if anything, we deserve nothing but hell. But the fact is that, we don't know what God wants from us, but God wants something from us. So that should call us into arms to, believe in that and also practice a love that isn't self-love. And I think Pascal takes this on, if I understand not only Pascal right, but Lacan and the French Marxist Lucien Goldman correctly, that Pascal's worldview is a tragic worldview. And really to have this good life is to wager the fact of the belief of God or not non-belief based upon a good life. But this notion of grace is important because what comes in the fact is that this wager is predicated off the fact that, well, if there is a God, he wants something from you. And we can only say that he wants something from you. That is the sort of weird logic that's you grapple from that. Well, if there is a God, we could just know that he wants something. So this is what makes it real, because there's this unknown component to it, but only that he wants something. And so for Lacan, why this is the sort of real is because we're dealing with the unknownness of the other, the grace that we're supposed to get, this desire of the other, but we have to wager for it. And we have to deal with this sort of impossibility that comes with not only the knowledge of what the other wants, but that it has to deal with me, and my wager depends upon will I have a good life or not? And I think that is important, is because, well, one, we could talk about the fact that for Lacan, Pascal is a pervert in my sort of butchered exegesis of the Pascalian wager, but that also this whole thing about the other is important because, unlike Descartes, who relies on the fact that God does not deceive, for Pascal, he witnesses the sort of a hole and inconsistency in the other. So he wants to restore the the resiliency of the other, right? And for Lacan, of course, the other is already barred, and Pascal, through this notion of the objet a. So objet a is not only for Lacan this notion of the thing that causes your desire. It is not just plus de jouir, a surplus jouissance. It is also the little other, which would be the truth that would complete the other, right? It would make the other whole. And so in analysis, our wager is that we're always trying to, chase after the thing that causes our desire to complete something in the other, right? Our unconscious, and, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but one of the definitions of the unconscious for Lacan is that the unconscious is the discourse of the other, right? And I think that still holds. There's always these different references of the definition of the unconscious or drive or whatever in Lacan or jouissance. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Kind of the way that Catholics in Bible study will always get all these phrases of what Jesus says and combine them, be we have this consistent reading. In a sense, we kind of have to treat that the same way with all these definitions with Lacan. People might scorn at me and be like, oh, no, we're not theological like that. But my point is that a lot of these, I think a lot of these definitions, they do change over time, but they don't contradict one another. And for instance, the unconscious being the discourse of the other. Well, it's because I mentioned alienation. Our ego is already an other. He says this in Seminar 2. It relies on the other, this optical schema, this revolving mirror, this inverted bouquet becomes the image off the background of the other, this narcissistic image. The representation of the symbolic becomes a new image of the other which is the big other, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, Andrew, can I just put it in very, again, boring, pedestrian, colloquial language here? Here's the way I understood it, right? Um, I think for Lacanian theory and for Lacan, the subject is decentered.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
like
Yes.
for instance, someone like Carl Jung, he would speak of the unconscious, to use the overused iceberg metaphor, at the deep, like deep down there somewhere. Then he also coins this term called the collective unconscious, and he tries to make it like this, like a social unconscious. But for Lacan, for at the outset, the unconscious is already social. It already is, in some sense, outside of yourself. And so that's kind of the way I see how you make that connection between the unconscious and the other. But also I think I'm still struggling though to understand how you said that this allows us to come in contact with the real.
Yes, yes, yes. So first, you're right about the subject being decentered totally. And not only because of our own desire or whatever, but even this notion of the Copernican revolution, right? In knowledge already, decenters us.
It's a
And
good connection.
this is Freud's discovery of the unconscious and of the death drive is a Copernican revolution to
Yeah,
decenter us.
yeah. So what Kant said about his discovery, Freud should say about his discovery too. The Copernic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I even think in the reading of Cogent Karatani that Marx has a Copernican revolution as well. Um, but yeah, how this has to do with the real is mainly so okay. Um, there's no the way that the real operates in Lacan throughout his teachings again changes, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think Zizek has like this really great like way of explaining this in his intro to For They Know Not What They Do. Like we shouldn't see these things as separate. They're not substances or anything like that. They're rather interconnected. So you have like imaginary real, symbolic real, and real real.
Yeah,
Um,
I'll put an overlay of the Borromean knot to show
yeah,
interconnection.
so for like the early Lacan in Seminar One, the real is real image, and it is the sort of way that reality becomes instantiated upon this inverted totality, but not everything in like sort of the constitution of reality or the subject um is all there. Like some of it escapes. Now, of course, it's because of repression, right? And it always returns. And so it is by naming, one's desire or being able to name that we start putting this thing into time. The real in Seminar 2 becomes sort of really explicit more in this notion of impossibility, symbolic impossibility. So back to analytic philosophy in your session or in your talk with Potter, you know how he says that logic at its core is trivial.
Yes,
So
we discuss.
I would say that the Lacanian rendition of that is logic is impossible, right? And so we aim at an impossibility, and with this symbolic order. So he talks about the purloined letter, which is a story written by Edgar Allan Poe, right? About a letter that's taken. It's a letter that's like for the Queen. We don't know what it is, but one of uh, a sort of correspondent or associate of the Queen uh, takes the letter and replaces it with a fake one, and then a detective is hired to retrieve it. The detective, his name is Dupont, and he makes this fake story up saying that he found it. Well, I don't think it is actually fake, but like he found it, and then he's talking to the cop that's investigating it, and he's got the letter right there, but it's really a fake letter. And then like he uh, duped the cop with a fake letter. So the guy who originally stole it had the letter on the table and then like had another letter. So like we have an inversion of letters. But what's important about this impossible real is that there is a game that Dupin, the detective, recounts of saying like odds and evens, right? It's a game where you flip a coin and then you guess whether it's odds and evens. And the way that Dupin would trick his opponent was by making a face, right? And so that's his way of, saying like how he was savvy and how he was able to trick the cop investigating him with a fake letter, and by thinking it was real by making these like facial expressions that he used to do with the odds and evens game. But what Lacan likes about the odds and evens game, and it goes back to sort of computer programming, is that a machine can play this game. So, it's a 50-50 chance. Is it odds? Is it evens? Is it heads? Is it tails? Is it 0 or is it 1? Right. So we start off from this sort of fundamental logic, which is trivial, but it remains impossible because when you start to do this a number of times, you get 3 groupings. You could order these like tosses in multiple ways. If it like odds, so we'll do it plus and minus. So if you get a binary group of minus minus, that is an odd. If you get a group of plus plus, that is an even. And then I think it's like dissymmetry. If you get a plus and a minus, or a minus and a plus. And then like if you do this again in like sets of 3s, you could get a plus plus plus, or plus plus plus, 3 pluses, 3 minuses, or a minus plus minus, or a plus minus plus, right? So there's like
in computer science we call it the truth table. I mean,
so it's similar to a truth table.
Like a truth table,
And
yeah.
so my point is, in this like sort of exhaustive way, is to show that what Lacan is stating, that like the more you play this game out and ordered in different ways, you're going to get the same impossibility. So he orders these logics by 1s, 2s, and 3s, or he'll use Greek lettering, but we'll stick with the numbers. So like whenever you do a coin toss and you do this many things, no matter how many you group it, sort of a 1 and a 3 will never intersect. So like a 1 toss will never, or a 3 toss will never come after a 1. It must come after a 2, and it has to do with the fact that like, okay, you could get a plus plus and then a minus minus, but you could never get like a minus minus and another minus minus. Actually, that's the whole thing of the logic. Bruce Fink has a good commentary on it.
I'll have to find some graphics if possible to
if you can. I wish like I had like something to show.
I'll email you afterwards, and we'll sort it out, because there are a few things that's quite visual.
Yeah, it does require a lot of visual, but like you could think of it as heads or tails. The main point of the story is that there is an embedded impossibility, right? There is an embedded rule that keeps something from happening. And in the same way, the unconscious in this topology of the odds and evens from the Freudo-Lacanian letter does the same thing, but we would not understand it a priori. We only understand it, after the fact, when we group these things. Yeah, but it goes deeper than retroactively. It is combinatory logic, right?
Oh, okay.
It's combinatory logic, meaning that we get a truth effect from this combining factor in the same way that the signifier does the same thing, right? And we also get the truth about like what is, prohibited, or like, what is real, what is impossible from that, right? And that is what is real for Lacan at that time. Then real takes on still the same impossible thing, but in seminar 16, he will say that I'm different from structuralists because my structure is real. It is not symbolic. Structure for me is the realist because it aims at its own impossibility, right? And it is the topology of the subject that aims at jouissance, right? And jouissance is not only a loss, it's an excess, but it's also possible.
Yeah.
That is what he's getting at. And that this is what psychoanalysis is investigating. This impossible achievement of the pleasure principle or homeostasis, and that within the subject of the unconscious trying to achieve that, they have this logic. again, Russell's paradox, odds and evens of aiming at something, but it's also impossible, but that they start from an impossible point,
Mm.
um, doing it,
Is
right?
that where you connect it to the real, the impossibility?
Yes, yes, yes.
Beautiful.
Because it comes from a sort of a flawed logic, pretty
Yeah.
much, that we structurally create from a trauma,
Yeah.
right? That remains unconscious and must be free associated about.
Yeah.
Uh, that's what it means, to put it down in simple layman's terms.
Perfect, perfect. Mate, Andrew, I'm not, this is not me flattering you, but you blew past my expectations. I wasn't ex This was very good. I was expecting you to, keep things at a rather superficial level, but I think this is a fantastic presentation. You're a
Thanks.
great,
And I feel like it's very weird to get interviewed when I'm used to interviewing people. Not that I'm good at that anyhow,
yeah.
but I feel like, when I'm interviewed, like I'm one fixating on a different seminar, but then it's like I have to break this down now, because it's not like I'm like, okay, I know Lacan better than anybody else. It's like, okay, I may understand it. I may be picking on something that, I don't feel like is talked about enough, but it's like, then how do I break that down?
No, but
Right.
the thing is, my goal today was this sort of thing where the thing is, I didn't want to put the labor on you to kind of do a whole presentation, which is why when I reached out, I was like, hey man, let's have a discussion. But I think deep down, what I really wanted was exactly what you did, which was a
Mhm.
complete presentation. And then
Mhm.
I'll do the job of editing it, producing it, making it palatable to a
Yeah.
listener or a viewer, especially the parts to do with kind of the visual parts of it. I think it
Yeah.
came out well. Look, I feel like this has been beautifully done and also like very extensive. I just want to just to conclude on a concluding note, and you can say no if this is a bit, too
Invasive.
without obviously leaving aside the details, when you started off, right? So you started off saying, if you're interested in Lacan, Lacanian theory, any of that, perhaps consider going to see an analyst, going into practice. And I know for instance, your Lacanian analyst is in New Zealand, close to my country. And so tell us, how's that process been like to you? I mean, let's probably even just to provoke a bit, juxtapose that with, the current forms of so-called psychotherapy, the therapists that kind of thing. I think to conclude, after all, we are talking about something that's, yeah, there's a praxis behind it. It's not all abstract theory. Yeah, please tell us a bit about just like what it's like to go through a session of Lacanian analysis.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a very good question. I don't mind sharing at all. And funny enough, so when I was in the military, and I dealt with like suicidal ideation. The military's tough. I've dealt with a lot of depression. I've dealt with anxiety. Like, anybody can relate. We all suffer. I don't think I'm a miserable person. I think I'm trying to be as happy as possible, even though that is an impossible task, especially in the conditions that we live in, and
About it.
especially society that's discontent. But I wouldn't see myself as a sort of miserable person, but I have suffered a lot, and I've been through some hardships. And I think like uh I went through, like, through the military's like resources, some like CBT, DBT type work groups. And let me tell you, like, it's a joke. And you think the military is bad, the civilian side is just as bad. And the fact that they believe in this stuff is just comical. It's sad. And getting into philosophy at a young age, I was also into like Buddhism and theology. And I mean, I still am, but like I'm
Yeah,
more focused
yeah,
with,
man,
yeah.
seeing associate.
And yeah, and like, one of the things that I was more efficient at compared to people in these like CBT groups was meditation and mindfulness. And that came from my martial arts background, because I did Chinese martial arts, and one of the things I still do is Tai Chi, which is a martial art, although, like, there is a sort of meditative aspect and health qigong stuff, and then there is the actual combative stuff. But I did that, so, and I still do it, and it is helpful. But I don't, it hasn't like made me, whatever. But the point is that, like, I was like, I mean, I study philosophy. I feel like, I'm already at something that, like, so I feel like some of these like people have a hard time putting into words, and maybe they do need this stuff, but this isn't helping me. And I actually sought out an analyst, a Jungian. So I was under Jungian
Oh,
analysis
you never
for
told me
actually,
this. Yeah, that's
yeah, I
it.
was actually under Jungian analysis for 2 years, and I saw him in person. And it was helpful for the time that I was undergoing it, but to be Lacanian, it was too imaginary. And what do I mean by that? Well, first, it was very therapeutic in the way where he was like trying to be a perfect mirror for me. He was trying to be as compassionate as possible of his best understanding, and I'm sure he's really good. And the jolly old man, he seems probably like he's a good dude. But there was a lot of resistances on my end, and I think it was mainly because one, I knew that I wasn't getting anything out of it, but then also simultaneously still investing myself in Lacan at that time, that I was also struggling with that. And we were focusing on a lot of dreams, which I was having a lot of dreams. I think there was a transferential effect, but it was focusing on all these minute details about the symbols of the dream that I felt like it missed the forest for the trees, and I wasn't getting anything out of it. And I felt like it was the analyst positing his own resistance into it. And then, as I got more deep into Lacan, I finally decided to reach out, and I saw, I finally reached out to the analyst that I had now. You're right, he's in New Zealand. And I'll share it, like, if you follow me on Instagram or anybody, any of your followers, I will post a lot of his content on there. Because he posts a lot of good stuff, like some quotes from Lacan. Radically different, because I would say the same stuff of what I would say in my session, and the interpretations were not only radically different, but they also hit differently, and touched more on the sort of demands and injunctions that not only my family like surrounded me with, or I was surrounded with in the military, but also like in relation to like the way that my father raised me, and even the way that like goes beyond just the family, like the father's father or the father's mother, and the way that the family tree of signifiers and injunctions and all that stuff passed down to you, that was not talked about at all in my Jungian analysis. And sometimes I would even talk about dreams too, and they would have no clinical effect whatsoever in the interpretation. And then he would talk about something more randomly, and I'm like, wait, why are you talking about this? But then when I free associated on them more, like it ended up being like, wow, I discovered something new that I didn't before in analysis. And I've been seeing my Lacanian analyst now for, I think, almost 2 years now. And I think both from what I learned from my Jungian was kind of just like more of like something of a coping. But I think this one is more of just like a radical, like, um, I don't want to sound cliche, but it's like I'm going through destitution. But I don't feel like it's a despair. I feel like I'm trying to like accept that, like, the world that I'm trying to live in is a world that like no longer fits me, because I'm dealing with like, I'm trying to pretty much like hold on to a past that no longer exists, and I need to be okay with letting that go and develop myself, especially the fact that like one of the major themes is getting out of the military, becoming a civilian again. But I'm not a civilian again, I'm actually somebody new, because I'm someone that's interested in like all this stuff, Lacan, Marxism, etc. And I have an aspiration for this that nobody in my family has. I'm like, the only Lacanian, only philosopher, etc. And also somebody, I don't have a degree, I've never been educated formally, but none of my family is educated formally. We're all working class, Mexican American, and both sides of my family, family from Mexico. So like the Mexican American background, being in LA, the stereotypes that we live by, and then like, I'm the sort of black sheep outsider, working class, but then like I have this sort of education that a bourgeois or middle class person would get, but I've never been to university. So all these sort of like pieces that don't fit. And then like I'm the only one in my immediate family that joined the military. So like all these associations, and I think that my analyst is really keen on really dissecting this. He's not bringing closure, he's dissecting me, or I'm
That's
dissecting.
Would you say that your previous Jungian analyst, and again, nothing again, I'm sure he's a lovely man, whatever, cool dude, as you said, would you say that he wasn't really doing a lot of that, but rather more focused on your dreams, and more kind of what Jung really, myths and all that,
He was focused on being the Jungian, and that was
starts in your life?
allowing me to heal, allowing me to transform myself.
Mm.
And that's not what Lacanian or Freudian
Or
analysis.
healing. Yeah, that's one thing Leon Brenner made very clear when I spoke to him a couple of times. Yeah, no, that's beautiful, man. Yeah, I'm glad. I mean, also on the note of transference, do you feel like there's something like a transference going on in your, like right now in your with the Lacanian analyst?
Yeah, and I guess an example would be, and like sometimes I don't think like we've like stumbled upon anything new, and I'm just like I feel like I'm talking and like I'm not gaining any insight, and that's my own desire and fantasy. I need insight. But then like he'll just say something random that like caught me off guard, and just like, wait, this dude's sly as fuck. Like, say more. Like, but
Yeah,
it's me. I have to say. I'm the one that has to say more, not
yeah,
him.
yeah,
The
yeah.
fact
I
that
see,
like
I
he came
see.
up
Yeah,
with from
yeah,
my question, like, what does this mean?
yeah.
And it's just something that like I wouldn't even thought about. Because I'm so fixated on trying to, one of the points about the imaginary is that you catch yourself trying to imaginarize yourself by trying to understand everything, by trying to like put the pieces together and
Yeah.
connect the dots and be the Inspector Gadget before the analyst tries to do it. You try to one up them,
Yeah,
right?
almost like what a psychotic subject would be doing, right? When their world is decentered, they try to bring it all together.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. Or
Similar.
like what the neurotic would do was just like, look, I brought it all together. Here you go.
Oh
What do
yeah,
you
yeah,
think?
yeah. Do you know
And
the analyst Stain Van Heel?
what is it?
Stain Van Heel. He's a
Oh yeah. You had him on the channel. Yeah.
yeah.
Why psychosis is not so
But he was
crazy.
kind of saying that the neurotic subject's kind of like an idiot. It's kind of like, oh, we've got it all figured out. Anyway, no, thanks, man. Thanks for sharing it. That was beautiful. And yeah, I hope I wasn't being too invasive. I know, obviously, it's a personal thing. Uh, Bro, this is, what can I say? One of those conversations that really went way past my expectations. Thank you, Andrew. This,
I
I can,
appreciate that. And
yeah.
I was hoping to do my best because I mean, like I watched some of your stuff and you have some heavy hitters on there.
Oh,
And
cheers,
it's
man. No, look, I can promise you this, right? I mean, I feel like you made such an effort to articulate yourself and at the same time be succinct while also not simplifying things in like a condescending way, but really getting across what Lacan's all about. So I can promise you that I'll try my best to edit this in such a way where it's a palatable let's call it product even for the for the listener, where they can like digest it. So we'll work on that together. But nah, man, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for having me. Anytime. We'll keep the conversation going,
Oh,
Continue
100%,
to fail.
100%. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, keep working on that impossibility.